Hey everybody, welcome to Breakshift's pathing guide for Vault of the Void. Pathing is really important in Vault, mostly because of all the information the game gives you ahead of time. Pretty much as soon as you show up in a floor, you can see exactly what you can expect, which cards are going to drop from every single fight, and there's no random events or anything, no question mark rooms, everything is made clear from the get-go. And if you take full advantage of that information, you can be much better prepared to clear the floor and eventually win the run, as opposed to just kind of haphazardly choosing things as you go. So I figure first let's look at the legend, and I'll talk about which tiles should be priorities, and then I'll do a quick example of how I choose a path, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you guys. So to start, standard encounters, obviously these mostly are going to be important for the cards they give you, and what cards you will or won't want is going to be completely different from one run to the next. That's the biggest factor in whether you should go to one of these, but of course we can't forget that they can have upgrade points as well, they can have potions, and of course the card pack, although this is kind of a special thing, so we'll get to that later. Upgrades are very important to find. Usually I would recommend trying to maximize upgrades, but in general the regular encounters are something you'll fill in between other more important nodes, so I don't have too much of a focus on that. The one exception when you should beeline for a particular regular fight and make certain you go there is if there's a specific key card that you need to completely change your deck. Usually that's going to be some kind of rare. So, maybe you need 1,000 fists or whatever on your Enlightened deck because your damage output is low, or you need counter for your hidden deck to block or something. In those cases, you're not very likely to find anything that's going to replace that super easily, so go right there. But otherwise, think of these things more as steps along the way through more important nodes. Next we have elites. These are some of the most important tiles that you're going to find. You almost always want to fight all 4 elites if possible. Obviously if you feel like you're going to die, you can avoid them, but even then, it's often better to go in and try your best to win just so you can get that relic, versus dodging it to try and play it safe, and you'll have a higher win rate, usually, I think, when you do fight those elites. Relics are just really, really important. The fact that you get to pick between 3 of them is a huge deal. The fact that you get to have the relic before the fight begins is a big deal. Almost always I start by trying to make sure both of the elites are in my path. We can skip the boss because you of course have to go there. Next we have chests. Regular yellow chests here will have 3 cards for you to pick from. You get 1. You get some amount of money, some amount of souls, and 1 upgrade point. The upgrade point is usually the biggest draw of the chest. You don't have to fight for it or anything, of course, like a normal combat. You just get it. And besides that, the cards can be good. Usually, these are going to be mostly common cards, and sometimes uncommons. I'm pretty sure it's impossible to get rares from regular chests. So if you don't see a particular kind of card on the floor that you might really want, so maybe you want something specific like a void coin generator or something for daughter, and you don't see many of those or any on the floor, then this is another chance to find one of those kinds of cards, but it's not really reliable. You're only looking at 3. So mostly just think of these as an easy upgrade and a little bonus alongside with the extra resources you get. Next we have the standard card shop. This is actually surprisingly a somewhat low value node most of the time, because it costs a lot of money to buy good cards. Good cards meaning higher rarity cards, upgraded cards. That's what you really want to get out of this. You're always going to be offered 2 commons, 2 uncommons, and 2 rares, and you can choose to buy any of them regular or upgraded for an increased cost. Almost always you should buy the upgraded version of the card if you can afford it. Don't worry about saving the money. The upgrade is going to be better value. This is kind of like the yellow chests in that if you're looking for a specific card or kind of card, this can be a decent way to try and find them if they're not available on the floor normally. Also, because you're getting to look at 2 rare cards, that can be pretty valuable because the rare card pool is relatively small. So if you're looking for a specific rare, this could be a decent way to try and find it. But again, don't bank on it. You know, I wouldn't pin your run's success or failure on trying to find one specific rare from this shop. Especially once you start playing with tight pockets, it's going to be not very helpful a lot of the time. Nevertheless, if you do path through here, right, even if it's just kind of incidental, and you see a card that seems like it would be pretty decent, I would suggest if you have the cash, go ahead and buy the upgraded version of it. You'll appreciate that extra upgrade. But in general, not a super high value node. Next we have the Soul Collector, and this is an interesting one. I always like to say that the Floor 2 Soul Collector tends to be the most important node on any given run of Vault of the Void. So on Floor 2, I pretty much say, unless you find a different place to spend your souls, basically just the Queen for the most part, you should be guaranteeing that you go to the Soul Collector above all else. It's the single most important thing that you can do. Even if it means that you'd have to give up on fighting an elite or healing at a shrine or whatever, make sure you go there. On the other hand, on Floor 1, it tends to be a really low value node because you usually won't have enough souls to buy much of anything valuable here. It's not the worst thing ever, but of course, every soul you spend at the first one is one less soul you'll have to spend at the second one. Usually it's better to have saved up souls to buy stuff later on, because then you know the general direction of the deck is pretty much set in place at that stage, right? You know what cards you have access to on that floor, you know a lot of the relics you've already acquired, and so on and so forth. You can make a better informed decision and get more synergistic relics. And of course, just being able to buy 1 or maybe even 2 rares, even if they're not explicitly like super synergistic with your build, is usually going to be a better deal than buying like, you know, a common relic at the first one and then, you know, an uncommon at the second one or something like that. So super duper high priority Floor 2, low priority Floor 1. Spellchild, this is generally a very low priority tile. The spells that you can get from him, some of them are pretty good. There's some real winners, but a lot of them are not that good. The cost on these is generally pretty low. They're very cheap, so that's not really the main concern. The biggest issue with this is just that it's often a hard sell to swap out your starting spell. The starting spells pretty much always have good synergy with the character you're playing, and you'll almost always be using them quite a bit to strong effect. And with this thing, you never know, right? Like, sometimes you might get Weapon Switch on Daughter, which you can just run instead of Curse, and that's really, really good. But other times you'll get, you know, random useless stuff like Rage on that Corruption Daughter deck, and that's not useful. So, this one I'd say just only ever pass through it if it happens to line up with the rest of your pathing, and never really make a point to go towards it. Twisted Shrine, this one, it varies the most based on your instability modifiers. In general, if you don't have like any modifiers that affect the shrine on, it is a decent node to go to, mostly to be able to pray for greed and get essence and souls. Extra soul income is really nice, very helpful. And if for whatever reason you have voids in your deck, then it becomes very strong. So obviously if you've picked up a sin, or if you did a dark idol deal or something of the sort, and of course, most commonly, if you're just starting with voids from your instability modifier, then this becomes a really, really good node. Getting voids out of your deck is an enormous improvement. But otherwise, it's not that useful. You know, it does provide healing, of course, but if you're struggling to perfect fights, that probably means that your deck just needs to be worked on more, or you need to get better at the tactical element of just performing combat better. The game is designed in such a way that you can usually win by a perfect fight if you are building your deck well and playing well within that fight. You shouldn't be taking damage constantly. It's, you know, you'll get hit here and there, of course, but usually there's a way to perfect the fights, and so healing becomes not particularly valuable once you become a more skilled player. Of course, don't feel bad about using them if you're less experienced. Everybody's there at some point, but you should start leaning on the healing from this less and less. Especially if you're still healing for all or most of your health between floors, then you really don't need to worry about this. Obviously, if you're like super low on health and you think you're going to die, then this could theoretically save the run and keep going, but it's kind of similar to what I was talking about with elites. If it's really going to mess up your path to go to the shrine and you're going to lose out on other valuable nodes, just try and push through and see, you know, maybe you can pull it off without the heal, and if you do, you'll be in a much better spot. It might actually be the better win rate play a lot of the time. Just something to consider. The class trainer. The class trainer is not a particularly valuable node to go to. Obviously, you have to have a neutral card in order to use him at all. So if you don't have a neutral card, it's a completely dead node, a total waste. If you do have a neutral card, there's a chance you might actually want to keep it in your deck, right? Maybe you have a natural 20 or something. You probably don't want to give that away. But if you do happen to have a neutral card that you don't want to use, which isn't that uncommon, this is a decent way to have a chance at improving the quality of that card, and you get a free Void Stone too. That's a huge deal, actually. The Void Stone goes a long way towards making this valuable. If you can put in a higher rarity card, then your chances of getting back a card of high rarity will be better. So especially if you have a uncommon, or I guess even a rare that you're not using that happens to be neutral, although that's not super likely you'll have a rare. The value of this does bump up a decent amount, but it can cost quite a bit of money to roll multiple times, and you'll usually end up wanting to roll more than once if you're intending to get much value out of this. So kind of takes a decent number of things lining up for this to be a good node, but when that all does come together, it's decently valuable. Worth noting as well, if you're on Daughter, the fact that the card comes with a Void Stone is a huge deal. Even if you don't care about the card itself, it's usually worth it for Daughter to just put in some random card, roll it, and then use her special ability to take the Void Stone out of that card. Just getting the Void Stone this way is a pretty good deal. Speaking of Void Stones, we have the Void Stone Salesman. This is also a somewhat low-value node. Buying the Void Stones from him is kind of costly. There's really two use cases for this that make it a good node. One is when you're looking for a very specific color of Void Stone, if you don't have one coming up on your bar anytime soon. So like maybe after I get this first Blackstone, you can see it's going to be quite a while until I get another one. And maybe I used this one already, and there's a card that I found later I really want to put a Blackstone in. This is a pretty good way to find a specific color stone like that, right? Because you get to look at two Void Stones immediately, and then you can re-roll both of them into different colors. So out of the 6 basic colors here, you'll get to see 4. Pretty good odds that you'll find what you want, even if it is going to cost you a bit. The other thing that it lets you do is just turn money into immediate power, because no matter what situation you're looking at, you're going to have a card that doesn't have a Void Stone in it that will become more powerful when you put a Void Stone in it. You can't even say, like, oh, what if you get green or whatever, because there's always at least 2, right? So if your deck's not in a great place, if the run's not looking like it's going well, you can just turn money into power, and that's a useful thing to be able to do. This is a decent way to do that. But otherwise, if the run seems to be going at a good pace, and if you're not really looking for a specific Void Stone, just path through it if it happens to make sense given the rest of your stuff, just like the Spell Child, but don't really make much of an effort to go there. Another very similar situation with the Potion Vendor. This is an even better way to bail yourself out of a bad situation in the early game, or to like make a final push maybe in the late game to get to floor 3 so that you can get the healing after the floor 2 boss or something, right? Potions are a very great way to patch up holes in the deck temporarily while you find more long-term solutions like relics and cards. So again, if you really want to get a boost in the early game, good idea to find this place. And if you're looking for one very specific potion for whatever reason, maybe you really want a stealth potion to guarantee you have that for the void fight because you're a really setup heavy deck or something, you know, this is an okay way to try and find that. I don't think that's a situation you'll be in often, but something to consider. Otherwise, it's not a very high value node. Next we have the Cursed Idol. Here you'll be able to buy different kinds of relics based on what you pay. It's either put 3 voids in your deck for a rare, pay a cost in souls for an uncommon, or pay a cost in essence for a common. These nodes are really, really strong. The earlier you can find them, the better in most cases. One of my favorite ways to start a run of Vault of the Void, and one that I think is really powerful, is if you can go to an early floor 1 Dark Idol and take a rare relic. You've got a long time ahead of you to find shrines where you can remove those voids, and the power of a rare relic early in the game is hard to overstate. It's going to help you just crush through early fights, and usually more than make up for those voids. Really strong option. If you find it later on in floor 2, maybe there's only 1 shrine afterwards, and you think you're going to be stuck with 1 void for the rest of the run, it can still be well worth it to go ahead and take that deal. I probably wouldn't take it if you think all 3 voids are going to be stuck in your deck, unless you're doing some kind of crazy sifting or discarding thing with Daughter, maybe. If you're in a situation where you don't want the rare, both of the other 2 options are pretty good. It's a reasonable deal to get an uncommon relic. It's a reasonable deal to get a common relic there. If you are still looking to save up souls for the coming Soul Collector, then probably don't buy the uncommon. You'd probably rather have the souls for the Soul Collector. But at the very least, you can still get a common relic, and that's pretty nice. So, very good node. This one's definitely worth keeping an eye out for. The Dark Mime, this one is a huge variance in terms of how good it is based on what targets you have for cloning. Obviously, you want to clone high-value cards, so cards which are upgraded, cards which have stones in them, cards which are just generally really important for your deck. But do keep in mind, of course, that it's a higher cost to clone them based on whether or not it has a stone, whether or not it's upgrade, and how high rarity it is. Usually, I would say if you can take 2 voids or less and then purge them somewhat quickly afterwards, you should do that. If it's going to cost you a lot of voids and you don't have a quick way to cleanse the voids, it's pretty decent to pay souls, assuming you have a good target. This is another one, though, that I wouldn't say is usually worth, like, beelining for. So it is kind of comparable to something like the Stonesmith in that regard, maybe. It can be pretty good, but it's usually not going to be a key part of your game plan. If you do just happen to pass through one, it can be an okay deal to just clone something cheaply, right? Even if you have a better target, it's not always worth it, right? So, hard to say exactly how good this is or isn't. It really does just depend on your deck. The Disheveled Salesman, where you can spend essence for artifacts. This guy is kind of rare to show up. How good it is mostly dependent on RNG, unfortunately. A lot of it is just going to come down to how much money you spent on floor 1 before you find this thing on floor 2. Because if it shows up on floor 1, you're probably not going to have enough money to buy much of anything valuable there in the first place. And if it shows up on floor 2, well, did you just spend a bunch of money at, a class trainer or a stonesmith or something? Did you just buy some cards at the shop? It's probably not very valuable. Did you buy a bunch of stuff in the Well of Stars, right? The expensive options, then it's probably not very valuable. If you didn't happen to do any of that stuff because you didn't pass through those nodes or the well didn't work out, then this suddenly becomes a really high value node because you can get more rare relics this way, and rare relics are a huge deal. So if you do end up with a lot of money, this is a great way to turn that into some power for your deck. If you don't have much money, it's pretty bad. His stuff is kind of expensive. Nevertheless, if you do happen to pass through it, it's probably still worth it to buy something, assuming you can afford it. Even just a common relic is a pretty good boost in power. Next, we have the Blood Library. A lot of the stuff about the Blood Library is similar to the ability just to look at high-rarity cards from the card shop that I mentioned. This is a good way to see more cards and to see specific cards, because you're going to look at 3 uncommons and 2 rares, and you will always be able to obtain as many of those cards as you want. because it costs maximum HP. That's the biggest difference with the card shop. You can definitely get these cards no matter what, so it doesn't matter if you've spent all your money. It doesn't matter if you don't have much health or anything like that. You know you can afford this. Of course, sometimes you'll show up here and none of the cards are any good. Sometimes you'll show up and all of the cards seem great. My advice would be to almost always buy at least one card here when you go through, unless they're just like really bad options. But usually it's definitely going to be good to get one card at least for a boost of power when you go through here. You never want to go through a node and gain nothing out of it. You want to be improving yourself somehow. So it's really good to be able to pick up something here. If you want to try and pick up extra cards to get the relics, I'd say that the 3-card relic, which gives you delay block 2 for playing an uncommon card and delay block 3 for playing a rare card, that one's pretty decent. Often it's worth getting it. The one that requires you to get all 5 is usually not worth it, just because, you know, it's a card game. You're drawing random cards off the top of your deck, and sometimes the RNG is going to work out unfavorably and you will take some unavoidable damage. And when that happens, you don't want it to end your run on the spot. If you take all 5 cards in a blood library, oftentimes that will end your run on the spot. So probably avoid doing that if you're playing on high difficulties and you're worried about dying being something that could happen to you. If you're playing on lower difficulties and you're just crushing it, sure, go for it, have some fun, but usually I'd say don't do that. Next we have the Lost and Found. This has artifacts that you chose not to grab from elites, and it has cards that you could have gotten from like chests and stuff. You can get a common card always for free, which is pretty decent. You know, it's just a free card. So that's always some amount of value you can get out of this guaranteed. But what you really care about is buying an elite artifact. Normally, you're limited to 4 elite artifacts per run, and they're really, really strong. I made a big point about that when I was talking about elites. So being able to get a 5th one can be a huge deal, especially because you already know in advance which relics are available here. So if there's something that's even remotely decent, this is a pretty high value node, assuming you can afford it. Just, you know, keep that in mind. You do have to pay, right? And it's reasonably pricey. That being said, it's probably one of the best ways to spend your essence. If there's nothing in the Lost and Found that you particularly care for, don't bother with it. It really is just that simple. The Sins tile, I forget what this one's called exactly. This one, actually this one right here. Reflections of Sin, there we go. This one is very weird. You get to pick, out of 3 sins, you get to pick 1. And of course there's 7 of them to choose from total for the game to pull from. Some of the sins are usually going to be very good for your deck. Several of the sins will be completely worthless, and you have no idea which ones are going to show up. Right? Like if you're doing an attack damage deck, that's just like aggro, Wrath is going to be crazy good for you. If you're doing some kind of like, you know, huge foresight heavy Enlightened deck, then something like Pride is going to be really good for you, but it's just so volatile, right? You have no idea which ones you'll be offered, whether or not you'll want them. And of course, when you grab them, you get a void added as well, either 1 or 2 voids based on which sin you pick. And so if you can't purge them quickly after picking up that sin, that's going to be a bit of an issue. The sins themselves are kind of awkward sometimes if you do take them, because they're considered afflictions. You can't purge them, so they can actually cause you some problems sometimes, right? There are particular fights, like the taxidermist, where being stuck with that card in your hand can actually be a big problem. Nevertheless, they can also be some of the most powerful cards. It's either Gluttony or Greed, which one of those I can't remember, that says on draw a card. That's like insane. So it's very much just like a roll the dice kind of thing. If you're feeling lucky, maybe poke your head in and you'll find something crazy. Otherwise, probably don't bother. If you just want to play for like consistent wins, it's not a super impressive node. It is very fun though, so if you're just looking to have fun, definitely poke your head in. Next we have the Queen. This one can only spawn on floor 2, if I remember correctly. and it is pretty much just an alternative to the Soul Collector, as I kind of mentioned earlier. It's another way to get some really powerful effects for your souls. When you go in here, you'll be offered always the Queen Stone, which just gives trigger +1 to whatever card it's put into, and pretty much costs about the same as a rare relic at the Soul Collector. You'll be offered the King Stone, of which there are 2 variations for each character. And if you don't know what those are, I'll post a link to the Vault Companion website in the description of this video, and you can look it up there, what all of them do. So 50-50 shot of getting the king that you want most, 100% shot of getting the queen. After that, there will be a couple of smaller pieces. I believe there's 3, which are pulled from a generic pool that all characters have access to. Some of them are pretty good, like the Purge Loop one is crazy. So this is a really good option if you have a path that makes more sense with this than the Soul Collector. It's a great option if you know for a fact that you can do something super strong with the Queen Stone, because that's guaranteed. Often that's a really good thing to like put on buffs or whatever crazy damage cards you have, right? It's great on X-Cost cards on Tempest, for example. So if you think you can make the Queen Stone work, or if you have a good idea about what you could do with either King Stone, this can be a really, really strong node. So in those cases, it's on par with, or even potentially better than the Soul Collector, because the Soul Collector is still random. You don't know what rare relics will offer. You know you can get the Queen Stone here. That being said, it will sometimes be better to go to the Soul Collector anyway over Queen, but pretty comparable in terms of value on the second floor for these two. Lastly, here we have the Gray Chest. This one is 2 common relics or an upgrade point. You pick one of those things. Quite a bit worse than the Yellow Chest in terms of that upgrade point, the fact that it either gives you just the upgrade point or just a relic, whereas this gives you a card and some resources and an upgrade point. Nevertheless, common relics can be pretty good, especially in the early game, so early on, this is a pretty reasonable option to try and go to one of these, and even if the common relics happen to not make sense for you, you do still at least get something out of it. But I would say that in general, the yellow chests are better. And then lastly, like I mentioned, this is kind of a special node, the card pack. The card pack is always going to be on this exact tile on floor 1 only. The middle of the left edge of this little triangle here. It doesn't show up on the mini-map for whatever reason, but you can just always remember that this right here is where the card pack is, 100% of the time. It's just like the card pack you get when you start a run, 5 cards randomly. If you've mastered every card on the class, you can reroll one of them. It's an extremely high-value node, very, very valuable, almost on par, I would say, with an elite. Not quite as good, but it's pretty close. This is a great way, again, similar to what I was saying about the shop or the yellow chest, it's a great way to just look at more cards if something particular that you want to find is not on the floor. Just having more cards total, because you get 5 new cards in your backpack, is also really valuable. A lot of times these things will just be better than starter cards, even if only a little bit. And you'll have more options if specific synergies come together later on in the run, which is always great. Especially if you have the Mastery reroll, then things get really awesome. Being able to reroll uncommon or rare cards is really, really cool. So definitely try to hit this one as often as you possibly can. If you'd have to give up an elite to get it, you'll have to ask yourself some hard questions about what kind of deck you're trying to build, and if you think you can pull it off given the cards on the floor, or what you're likely to see next floor. But if you can get both elites and the card pack, that's usually priority number 1. And then it's not on the legend for whatever reason, but the Raven's Gift. This node is also one like the Shrine that kind of changes a lot based on what instability level you're playing at. When you go there, you'll find a elite artifact, just one at random, and you can take it but gain 1 void in your deck. You can drain it, which gives you 8 souls, I believe, and 1 void, or you can destroy it and just get 3 souls. Just getting 3 souls and nothing else is, like, pretty okay. It's not amazing, but it's decent. Extra souls are always appreciated. But if you're playing with the take it or leave it modifier, which is usually one of the first I would recommend putting on, then this becomes, it's not an option to just get the 3 free souls. You're always getting a void if you get anything out of this node once take it or leave it is enabled. So is it worth getting 1 random elite artifact for a void? A lot of the time the answer is no, but again, it is still just another way to theoretically get your hands on an elite artifact. So if it so lines up that there's a shrine nearby, the fact that you're getting just 1 void is interesting as well, because voids get purged 2 at a time at the shrine. So if you already have exactly 1 void, for whatever reason, this is a good way to get up to 2, and then when you purge, you're getting full value out of that purging effect. So you can keep that in mind, and if you know for a fact that you won't have enough souls to do some particular thing you want to do, like afford a rare relic, this is a decent way to get a big boost at the cost of a void. Sometimes that can be worth it. Usually, I would say once you enable take it or leave it, though, the Raven's Gift is not a particularly valuable node. Anyway, so with that being said, let's go ahead and do a quick example. This is just a completely random run I've loaded up, haven't looked at this seed before, and we'll just go ahead and live do pathing. The first thing I do every time I load into a new floor is I click this button here, Map Rewards. This is a very important button. It shows you all of the cards that you know you're going to find on the floor. So this is just a hidden blade run. You can get a quick look at the cards I found here to start with. I've got Slick Strike, I've got some discard synergy, and I've got a big chunky block card. So I already know that I have my early game damage handled with Slick Strike. This is a great way to kill early elites, and mostly it's going to handle a lot of the short-term fights. I know I'm looking to pick up more stuff that interacts with discarding, because I have 2 things that allow me to discard and 1 thing that benefits from discarding. And I am less in need of finding good block because I already have 1. So when I look at the map rewards, I see we have Sleight of Hand, and this is a great synergy for discard, so let's go ahead and click that. What else do we have here? I see I have Bleed It Out. This doesn't particularly synergize with anything, but the purge effect on this is just pretty strong in general. I don't have any bleed synergies besides the Slick Strike, but that's enough for me to say this is worthwhile. Being able to purge and get 3 bleed on everyone will help out for sure, so I'll click that. I see we have Backup. This is 1 card that puts 3 cards in my hand, so that's really nice with the discard synergies. I can discard these lighted ups that turn them into real cards. And being able to just play the 1 lighted up that's left over after using something like a battle plan or a juggle is pretty valuable. It does deal pretty reasonable damage, so let's highlight that. Especially if we upgrade this thing, being able to purge it to gain a volatile lighted up as just single cards I can discard, very nice. Lastly, we just have a couple workhorse powerful cards here. Dawn Raid is a really good offensive card. And what else do we have? From Shadow is a pretty good block card. Scheme, if I were to upgrade it, is nice interaction with this card. I don't know if I'll have the upgrade to spend on it, but we'll go ahead and highlight it just to see. And that's everything I really care about. So now we can see all of the cards that we clicked on there are highlighted in blue here. Now what I'll do is highlight the other nodes that I really care about. So that's always going to be the elites and the card pack here on floor 1. And we can already see there's some nice paths that have kind of emerged for us. Here we can go up this line, touch the shrine, and then come down here and grab all of these things that we care about. That's really nice. Now we just need to tie it together with the rest of the map that we're looking at here. I can see that there's a blood library here, so it might be nice to go from this tile that I highlighted, come down through the blood library, and connect like this. So if I'm coming down here, that means that I need to be approaching this tile from here. So, because if I were to come from the bottom, like from here, then this tile falls away, and I can't make that path anymore. So that means I would have to walk through here. And now we've got some mutually exclusive tiles. I cannot get both this elite and these blue tiles down here. The From Shadow is not super important. I just put it on there because it's a pretty decent block card, but I think the block is going to be alright given that I already have the shield wall, given that I have a slick strike, which is potentially going to provide me with some block, and just the power of being able to purge parries and gain block from quickness. Those are all pretty decent ways to handle defense. So I think we can give up on the From Shadow. The Bleed It Out is going to hurt a bit more because I don't really have another way to put Bleed on yet, but Bleed is not something that's extremely difficult to come by in Hidden's kit, so I'm willing to sacrifice this for the Elite here. Then lastly, we see that I have the scheme here that I highlighted with the stone in it as well. I can just very simply connect that like this, or alternatively, I can come down this way and exchange these 2 nodes for these 3 nodes. Now I can just do an apples-to-apples comparison of how valuable I think this red path is compared to the upper path. So obviously I'm getting 3 nodes as compared to 2. That's a pretty big deal. This is going to give me 1 upgrade point if I go up the top versus 2 upgrade points if I go along the bottom. And of course I'm going to get 2 cards from the bottom here. I'm also going to get 2 cards from the top. This one I'm going to be picking from 3 instead of knowing for a fact what it is, so I have to consider that. I can also see that I'm potentially, if I go through the Raven's Gift, I could take on a Void and carry it with me until I come here and then purge it. So it actually is kind of seeming like the bottom path will be a little bit better in that regard then. I'll get more total tiles this way, which is generally a good thing to do. I'll get the same number, or I get a higher number of upgrades as opposed to this, and upgrades are really valuable. I have the option to take a Void here if I find a really good Raven's Gift option. All of that sounds really good to me as well. I guess last thing to note is that I could step on this empty tile too. If you're playing with the collapsing hallways modifier, the second one on the list here, that'll cost me 5 health. It's not really worth it to step on an empty tile if you have collapsing hallways on. Otherwise, there's no real reason not to. Final thing to consider, I guess, that I didn't mention is that the empty sections up on the top here, where like you could imagine an extra tile fitting but there isn't anything, these can have secret rooms. I'd assume most of you have probably found at least one of those by now, but if you haven't, basically there is a secret tile sometimes hidden in one of these empty slots, always on the top. As of currently speaking, I think it's a bug that they don't spawn on the bottom, and that might be worked on, but as of speaking, they can only appear on the top, only in these empty slots, these 3. And what they can do for you is they'll give you a choice of 3 rare cards, Essence and Souls, and you get 2 upgrade points, which is a really big deal. These are super valuable. Sometimes it'll fix your pathing if you find one of those, and what would have been a tough decision becomes a much easier decision. Sometimes it's just a free node, so like for example, if there's one right here, I could just grab that immediately, and it would save me 5 health and just give me some extra stuff. Something to keep in mind, not something to really rely on, because it might just not appear. I don't know the exact rates. They're not exactly the most common. But just something to keep in mind. Yeah, if you don't know how to highlight tiles, I guess I can mention that as well. You just right-click on them. They'll cycle through green, red, and then back to normal. And the route planner as well, if you're not familiar with that, of course, it just kind of simulates what'll happen. Last thing to mention, I guess, is the little sort of trick to pathing, where the game always has to provide you a path forward, and so you can wedge yourself into a corner to sneak out some extra nodes. You can see here, if I follow along this path, and then we get to this point here, if I just go straight here, of course, then the shrine would fall away, and normally if I go up here, this tile would fall away, but then I'd have nowhere left to go, so the game is forced to give me an extra tile. I did the same thing down here as well. Decent thing to consider, but that more or less does it. That's how I plan a path. That's how I would suggest other people plan their paths. It'll definitely increase your win rate, having the best path possible. And hopefully this was helpful to you guys. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.